All right, I guess we can get to our speaker. It'll be Eric C. from West End.
Hi, everybody. My name is Eric. I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Eric.
I've stayed sober a day at a time since January 10th, 1983. I was 29 years old when I got sober, and I'll be 61 years old this week. Thank you very much. I'm grateful to have more than 32 years of sobriety in A, and I owe it all to this wonderful fellowship of men and women. Thank you for being here tonight. I live in Lake Leelanau with my wife, Gail, who is here tonight. She has 24 years of sobriety. We have 2 beautiful teenage children, and we'll celebrate our 21st wedding anniversary later this month. I can tell you that she is one of the main reasons my life is as happy, joyous, and free as anybody I know in our fellowship. I got sober and met my wife when I was on active duty in the United States Marine Corps. I served in the Marines for 25 years as a combat correspondent and a public affairs officer. I'm a veteran of Vietnam, the Persian Gulf War, and Somalia. Since I retired from the Marines in 1998, I've been working as a newspaper reporter in Leelanau County. Although I attend a lot of AA meetings in Leelanau County, I consider my current home group to be the West End group here in Traverse City, where I'm a regular at the We Agnostics meeting every Friday at 7 p.m. Tonight, this particular meeting began, as almost all AA meetings do, with a prayer and some readings from AA literature. The portion of Chapter 5 of our big book that was read aloud, How It Works, invoked the name of God no fewer than 6 times, and this meeting will close with yet another prayer to God. So I hope you won't mind if I spend a little time here tonight talking about God in relation to my own experience, strength, and hope as an alcoholic with long-term sobriety in AA. God and I go way back. I was raised in a loving and stable household where alcohol played no role in our lives, but faith in God played a central role. At my own request, my parents sent me to a religious high school where I took 4 years of Bible classes and attended chapel at school every day, in addition to church every Sunday. My high school was, and still is, a really excellent school, and I enjoyed my time there immensely. The school was filled with people I loved and respected and still do. We spent a great deal of time there learning about God and studying His Word. But I found that the more I studied our religion, the more questions I had. In fact, I came to a point in my high school career where my questions grew so troublesome that I felt I could no longer call myself a Christian. This put me at odds with my own family and nearly all of my classmates, something I didn't like, something I wanted to rectify. On breaks from school, I would sometimes spend days in prayer and fasting, often begging God to grant me some insight that would end my doubt and would give me some faith in Him. But I remained profoundly confused about whether God exists and even whether I could trust my own thinking on the subject. I didn't consider myself to be an atheist or an agnostic, just a mixed-up teenager who would eventually get it all sorted out. At the age of 18, I went to Michigan State University when the legal drinking age here in Michigan was 18. Life in the dorm at Michigan State was a revelation. I found I really liked smoking marijuana, and I found I was much better than most people at drinking and holding my liquor. I completed a reasonably successful freshman year at Michigan State, but decided I was more interested in travel and adventure than studying. I spent several months hitchhiking out west into Mexico, crisscrossing the United States, before I wound up in Florida with not enough money to return to college. So in 1973, at the tender age of 19, I enlisted in the Marines. By that time, the war in Southeast Asia was mostly behind us. Nonetheless, I found myself directly involved in the war's final chapter, the U.S. evacuations of Cambodia and Vietnam. I was literally on the second to the last American helicopter out of Cambodia just before the communists began turning it into a killing field. During the evacuation of Saigon, I also found myself in harm's way. Even though I experienced some moments of fear, I can report that it never once occurred to me to pray for divine protection. I had a very successful first enlistment in the Marines and made sergeant in less than 2 years. I even had some fun and definitely learned how to drink like a Marine. At the end of my active duty obligation, I returned to Michigan State University on the GI Bill and resumed my studies. As positive as my experience in the military had been overall, I didn't let that get in the way of my playing the part of a whacked-out Vietnam veteran who had some really good excuses for all the heavy drinking and drugging that I was doing. It wasn't long before I and others around me noticed that I could not control my drinking. Increasingly, I could not stay sober long enough even to make it to class, and I was soon flunking out of college. A friend of mine suggested I should consider going to Alcoholics Anonymous, so I did. I went to my very first AA meeting in 1979 at the Alano Club on the west side of Lansing. When I entered the building, there was a guy there who certainly looked to me like he could be an alcoholic, and he was. He was perched on one of the stools they had at a coffee bar in the club, chain-smoking unfiltered cigarettes. He informed me that if I had a problem with drinking, I was in the right place, and that the best thing I could do is get down on my knees today and ask God for help. I told him I really didn't understand much about God and wasn't sure that I ever would. But he made it clear that he understood quite a bit about the Supreme Being, was in touch with him daily, and that I needed to get in touch with God too if I expected to ever have any hope of getting sober. I don't remember what that guy's name was, but in the years that follows, it seems like I kept running into him, or at least someone very much like him, just about every time I showed up at an AA meeting. Over the decades, he's morphed into a kind of composite AA character for me, a guy I think of as Vern. Now, I apologize if anyone here tonight happens to be named Vern, but Vern is a very important character for me in my AA experience through the years. The very first AA meeting I attended, a noon meeting, started a lot like the one here today, with a prayer and a reading of how it works. Then, a bunch of guys who were on lunch break from their assembly line jobs at the Oldsmobile plant in Lansing began telling me all about their broken dreams, their broken families, their years in prison, and how I needed to be more like them so that I could gain knowledge of God's will for me and the power to carry it out just as they had. To a man, they insisted that AA is not religious. Then, when it came time to end the meeting, they asked me to join hands with them and recite what I recognized instantly to be from the Christian New Testament, the book of Matthew, chapter 6, verses 9 through 13, the Lord's Prayer. It became obvious to me by the end of my very first AA meeting that Alcoholics Anonymous was, in fact, a religious cult that was in denial about being religious. As a result of that experience, it would be years before I ever returned to AA, a period during which I could easily have died as a result of my alcoholism, and almost did on several occasions. In fact, things were going so badly for me at Michigan State that a Veterans Administration physician diagnosed me as an acute chronic alcoholic and admitted me to the VA hospital in Battle Creek for treatment. I found that many of those undergoing treatment at that facility were far worse off even than those losers at the Alano Club in Lansing. After I was off booze long enough to feel better, I checked myself out of the VA hospital long before completing their alcohol treatment program. It was then that I figured out what I really needed to do. At that time, I still had a reserve obligation as a Marine, so I decided that I would re-enlist for 2 more years of active duty in the Marines. What followed was a series of attempted geographic cures for my alcoholism that took me to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and through numerous deployments all over the world. And it almost worked. Around 1982, however, the Marine Corps started making everyone undergo urinalysis tests for illegal drugs, including my favorite, marijuana. We called the testing program Operation Golden Flow. So I stopped smoking pot, but my alcoholism took off like a skyrocket. I was even pulled over on base by the military police for drunk driving, and as a result was ordered to go to some AA meetings. But AA hadn't changed. In the meantime, I had also read the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous very carefully, and it became clear that I would never be able to make it in AA unless I believed in a God of my own understanding. And sure enough, when I showed up at an AA meeting outside the main gate at Camp Lejeune, who should be there but my old buddy Vern, or someone very much like him. Vern reminded me once again that while I could certainly be a member of AA without believing in God, I would never have what AA had to offer and would probably never stay sober for long unless I got God. By that time, I was getting so desperate that I just went ahead, got down on my knees one more time, and asked God for help. In addition to praying for knowledge of God's will for me and the power to carry it out, I also prayed that He would grant me some faith, some reason to believe that God exists. Vern told me that the AA program demands rigorous honesty. But if I had trouble in believing in God, Vern told me, I would just need to fake it till I make it. So I prayed and I prayed, but nothing happened. I remained just as ignorant and confused about God as I'd been for the past 15 years and stopped going to AA meetings. But I did get another set of orders to Marine headquarters in Washington, D.C. Yet another geographic cure seemed to work yet again, at least for a little while. But in less than a year, I found myself hospitalized for a second time with a physician's diagnosis of acute chronic alcoholism. Part of the treatment for alcoholism at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, involved going to AA meetings in the Washington, D.C. area. My main counselor at Bethesda was a Marine Master Gunnery Sergeant with more than 10 years of sobriety in AA, who told me his higher power was the Commandant of the Marine Corps. By that time, I had fully conceded to my innermost self that I was an alcoholic. This is the first step in recovery, according to Chapter 3 of our big book, More About Alcoholism. Through the process of going to AA meetings, I came to believe that people really were getting sober and staying sober in AA, and that probably AA could restore me to sanity as well. In trying to work Step 2, it seemed to me that people in AA were helping each other stay sober, and that the fellowship of AA was clearly far more powerful than I could ever hope to be on my own. Working Step 2 did not involve any leap of faith for me. I could plainly see with my own eyes how much people can and do rely on each other to get through hard times. I knew this as a Marine. I had learned in boot camp at Parris Island, South Carolina, and through many deployments overseas, that we Marines have something called esprit de corps. Esprit is a French word meaning spirit, and corps, spelled C-O-R-P-S, means the body or group of Marines. I learned that Marines can overcome seemingly insurmountable and life-threatening odds by relying on the spiritual bond they develop with each other through shared hardship and adversity. And I, like most Marines, was gung-ho about that. Gung-ho is a Chinese battle cry that means working together. The spiritual power I saw in AA seemed to be a lot like the powerful human spirit I'd experienced as a Marine, esprit de corps. I also observed that members of AA, like many Marines, were committed to helping each other, to working together, to being gung-ho. Even though I had no understanding of any kind of supernatural power that anyone might call God, I felt I had a sufficient enough grasp of Step 2 to take Step 3 and make a decision. I made a decision while I was still in rehab that I would stop trying to rely on my own will to stay sober and try it with AA's help. I decided that even after I got out of rehab, I would continue to go to AA meetings and to the very best of my ability do all of the things that AA suggested I should do to stay sober. One of those suggestions involved getting a sponsor. At one of the AA meetings I'd been to a few times, there was a guy I noticed who seemed a little different. When they closed the meetings with the Lord's Prayer, his lips weren't moving. After one meeting, I asked him what was up with that, and he said he was an atheist. His name was Robert, and he had 10 years of sobriety. He became my very first sponsor in AA, although I've had many more since then. These days, Robert has 42 years of sobriety and lives in South Carolina, and I'm still in touch with him. He's still an atheist, and he's still one of my sponsors. When I first met Robert, I never professed to be an atheist or an agnostic, just a blithering idiot, someone who really didn't get any of this God stuff in AA. I found that identifying myself as a blithering idiot at AA meetings went over far better than identifying myself as an atheist or an agnostic. After all, AA's co-founder, Dr. Bob, wrote on page 181 of our big book that he felt sorry for atheists and agnostics whose intellectual pride prevented them from understanding and accepting the God he believed in. I'd also read the book 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, written by AA's other co-founder, Bill W. On page 28 of that book, Bill made it clear that he thought atheists and agnostics were indifferent and prejudiced and defiant, assertions I knew to be untrue. In chapter 4 of the big book, titled We Agnostics, Bill declared flatly that God has come to all who have honestly sought him. Of course, I knew through personal experience that Bill W. was simply wrong on that point. I'd been seeking God as honestly, open-mindedly, and willingly as I could for many years, and God still hadn't come to me. I shared with my first sponsor, Robert, how troubled I was by much of what I was hearing around the tables and reading in the AA literature about God. I told him I thought a lot of AA seemed like religious nonsense, but obviously I'd have to get over that if I expected to stay sober in AA. My sponsor told me there was a simple reason I felt there was a lot of religious nonsense in AA. It's because there really is a lot of religious nonsense in AA. The good news, my sponsor told me, is that AA works anyway. You really can take what you need and leave the rest. My sponsor agreed that I should do as he did and try working the 12 suggested steps of AA to the best of my ability and understanding. Like him, I would probably need to interpret the steps so that they would make sense to me. It would also be a good idea, he said, to not drink and go to lots of AA meetings. In my first year of sobriety, some really good things began happening to me, and my career as a Marine began taking off. I was ordered to go to Syracuse University, where I completed my bachelor's degree. While in Syracuse, I found a new sponsor who helped me do a 4th and 5th step. Then I got orders to California, where I went through the same drill I'd gone through at my 2 previous duty stations, go to 90 AA meetings in 90 days, and find a new sponsor. And guess who stepped up to be my next sponsor out in California?
Vern.
You bet. It was Vern. Now, I'd already made a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of a power greater than myself, and I assured Vern that I would do exactly as he said. Vern, of course, wanted me to pray every morning and every evening. So, with all the earnestness at my command, I prayed twice daily for God to help me stay sober another day, thanked Him each night, and asked for knowledge of His will for me and the power to carry that out. I also prayed earnestly to develop some faith in God, because Vern and a lot of other people in AA were telling me I wouldn't make it past my 2nd year in AA unless I started relying on a God of my own understanding. Around that time, I began to notice that the 6th step had started working me. I became entirely ready to have my defects of character removed, but only when those defects of character began hurting me. About a year and a half of sobriety, my conscience and my empathy for other people started growing back. I found that whenever I acted like a self-centered jerk and said hurtful things to people, I actually felt like a self-centered jerk, and it hurt. It made me feel bad. So following guidance from my sponsor, I then worked the 7th step and humbly asked God to remove my shortcomings. Nothing happened. What I found was that I had to take responsibility for my own defects of character and on a day-at-a-time basis simply stop acting like a self-centered jerk. It occurred to me that there was nothing particularly earth-shattering or even very original about AA's 12 suggested steps. For the most part, the steps seemed like the kinds of things that all relatively normal, well-adjusted grown-ups did naturally if they were nice people. This included things like making amends to people they had harmed, so I did that. Continuing to take personal inventory and promptly admitting when you're wrong, step 10, also seemed like some pretty common sense advice that I found it easy to follow. As for the 11th step, I have found that taking some time for quiet reflection is a good exercise. In fact, science has shown that some significant mental and physical health benefits can be derived from certain types of meditation. As for prayer, I spent most of my second year in sobriety getting on my knees twice a day and praying just as my sponsor at the time had instructed me. And good things continued to happen to me. I got a new set of orders to the Officers Basic School in Quantico, Virginia, and the next thing I knew, people were saluting me and calling me sir. Then I got orders to Hawaii. In the process of putting my old sponsor, Vern, behind me, I got out of the habit of praying as Vern had instructed. But I did keep going to AA meetings on a regular and frequent basis and not drinking. I stayed sober and my life continued to get better. What I discovered through this transition is that AA works perfectly well when you pray. But I also found that AA works just as well if you don't pray. In fact, AA works a little better when you're being honest about your own authentic experience, strength, and hope in sobriety, and not pretending to engage in telepathic conversations with invisible supernatural beings. In fact, it's been almost 3 decades now since I prayed the way the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous says I should pray. And I've not only managed to stay sober, but my life has continued to get better in sobriety. When I was stationed in Hawaii, my home group was a step study group for which I served as a group service representative. I also sponsored several men. I went to a lot of AA meetings throughout the Pacific Basin, Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and on U.S. Navy ships at sea. After a few years, I received orders back to the mainland, to the East Coast. At the time, America was headed for its next war, and I soon found myself heading there as well. During Operation Desert Storm in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, I earned my 2nd Combat Action Ribbon, the Marines' equivalent of the Army's Combat Infantryman's Badge. Just for the record, ladies and gentlemen, there are atheists in foxholes, and if anyone tells you differently, they are either ignorant or they are liars. It's been my experience that the atheists in foxholes are the ones most likely to be doing something productive, like digging deeper foxholes. As for AA, my unit was either moving too fast or digging too deep, but I didn't make it to very many AA meetings during the Persian Gulf War. But I did attend a couple of AA meetings in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, at the Marine Expeditionary Force headquarters, but I mostly relied on letters from my many AA friends back in the U.S. After the Gulf War, the Marines sent me to the University of Oklahoma, where I earned a master's degree. And pretty soon after that, I found myself heading to Africa to participate in Operation Restore Hope in Somalia. In AA, our second tradition talks about a loving God who does things like express himself in our group conscience, among many other miracles he supposedly performs for those of us lucky enough to be in AA. But the Somali people weren't having much luck. In fact, there wasn't much sign of a loving God at all when I was working in Africa. The Somalis were in the midst of a civil war in which thousands of innocent men, women, and children were being systematically brutalized and butchered on a daily basis. Horrendous human suffering and famine were occurring on a biblical scale. It was in this environment that I and a few other U.S. military service members started an AA meeting in beautiful downtown Mogadishu. We met on the sprawling U.S. Embassy compound where the military's Joint Task Force headquarters was located, surrounded by a number of high-rise buildings. Our meeting was attended by myself and usually 4 or 5 other active duty personnel. It was so hot in Somalia that we decided to meet outdoors under a tree. That turned out to be a mistake. At our very first meeting, our little gathering of drunks was targeted by a Somali sniper from one of the nearby high-rises. Fortunately, the sniper was a bad shot. The next time we met, a few days later, we selected a different location on the opposite side of the compound, but sure enough, we took fire again. After that, we made a point of meeting under cover indoors despite the heat. It was our little AA group's inside joke that we closed our meeting in the usual manner by shouting, "Incoming!" So yes, I've actually had a couple of AA meetings shot out from under me. About a year after I returned from Somalia, I married my wife, Gail. We and our 2 tiny children were stationed in California in 1998 when I retired from the Marines, and we moved to Leelanau County. For about a decade up in Sutton's Bay, Gail was the treasurer and I was the coffee maker at the Sunday night Big Book study group in the basement of St. Michael's Church. On the occasion of my 30th anniversary in AA, I was asked to be the speaker at a monthly open talk in Leland, where in front of much of our local AA community in Leelanau County, I confessed that I had not been as honest about my authentic experience, strength, and hope in AA as I really ought to have been and intended to be going forward. At that meeting, I formally came out as someone who explicitly does not believe in God. I was no longer willing to call myself a blithering idiot anymore. Call me an atheist, an agnostic, a freethinker, a secular humanist, whatever. I don't claim to know that God doesn't exist. I simply don't have the knowledge or faith that any God does exist. And I certainly don't believe in the God that is clearly preferred by the authors of the Big Book. I am grateful, however, that back in the 1930s there was another atheist in AA named Jimmy B. who convinced his fellow alcoholics to insert the italicized words, "as we understood him," after at least 2 of the 4 direct references to God in the 12 steps. Jimmy kicked the door of AA open just wide enough for people like me to squeeze in. He died in 1974 with over 36 years of sobriety, still not believing in any kind of God. But most of our AA literature clearly advocates for a belief in God, and not a God of just any old understanding. The God that is read about aloud at almost every AA meeting around here is clearly a God who intervenes in individual human lives, a God who can restore you to sanity, a God to whom you can turn over your will and your life, a God who will perform miracles for you, such as removing your defects of character as long as you humbly ask Him to do so. The God of Chapter 5, How It Works, is not an acronym such as Good Orderly Direction or Group of Drunks that happens to spell out the word God in the English language. This is not a generic God. This is a supernatural, monotheistic God, the kind you can talk to and who talks back. A God who, if you pray to Him, will give you knowledge of His will for you and the power to carry it out. And He's probably male. And while it's true that nowhere in our literature does it say that you must believe in God or a God of any understanding in order to be a member of our fellowship, at nearly every AA meeting we let newcomers know that there is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find Him now. Half measures availed us nothing. Then we close nearly every AA meeting around here with a ritual recitation of Christian Holy Scripture, words which a student of the Bible can tell you instantly are believed to be those of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ Himself, the Lord's Prayer. But we're not religious. I have observed over the years that when newcomers come to AA, they are invariably hurting, confused, and desperate, but they are not all stupid. Increasingly, newcomers are showing up at AA's doors, but then at the earliest opportunity, they are turning right around and never coming back. AA's own official survey data support this. Periodically, our AA General Service Office in New York commissions a scientific study to estimate the size and composition of our membership. The fact is that in the mid-1990s, AA membership in North America plateaued at about 2 million members and hasn't grown since. Since the mid-1990s, however, the overall U.S. population has continued to grow. That means that in proportion to the overall population, a shrinking number of people per capita are joining AA and staying with it. Meanwhile, other survey data have revealed that one of the fastest growing demographics in the U.S. is the percentage of people who identify their religion as none. Just a couple of decades ago, that percentage was in the single digits. Today, roughly 1 in 4 Americans claims no religious affiliation. For those under the age of 30, the figure is 1 in 3. It's not unreasonable to conclude that AA is not growing, in part because fewer and fewer people are willing to buy into AA's religiosity. And the new generation of alcoholics in our society aren't the only ones who have a problem with AA's religious nature. A growing number of judges in state and federal courts across the U.S. have ruled that AA is in fact religious. Just this past October, for example, a man in California was awarded nearly $2 million after he was thrown back in prison for respectfully declining to participate in a 12-step treatment program that required him to pray. There is a growing body of case law that is already starting to inhibit the ability of judges in some states to sentence people to attend AA meetings. Many courts have ruled that forcing non-religious people to attend AA is a clear violation of religious freedom rights under the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now might be a good time for me to talk about Step 12. My decision to be more honest with my fellows in AA about the fact that I don't believe in God represents for me a form of spiritual growth, a continued spiritual awakening. I decided on the occasion of my 30th anniversary in AA to start doing a better job of carrying AA's message of hope to everyone and anyone who has a desire to stop drinking, whether or not they're willing to believe in any kind of God. I found that at many AA meetings, people who express any doubts or disbeliefs about AA's supernatural program of recovery are frequently subjected to instant rebuttal, correction, and sometimes downright hostility. This is especially so for newcomers. It even happens to old-timers like me. At a meeting I attended recently where I mentioned that I don't believe in God, a guy with less than a year of sobriety felt comfortable enough to look down his nose at me and say, "Well, keep coming back." In fact, you can read a story in this month's AA Grapevine by an atheist with 27 years of sobriety who says she's routinely treated poorly at AA meetings in her town just for being an out-of-the-closet atheist. I'm aware of only one AA meeting anywhere within a 3-hour drive of Traverse City that deliberately strives to be a secular AA meeting rather than a religious AA meeting. That's our We Agnostics meeting every Friday night at 7 p.m. at the West End Group. Although membership in AA has not grown since the mid-1990s, according to AA's own statistics, there's at least one segment of AA that is growing. The number of We Agnostics meetings and similar AA meetings has quadrupled in the U.S. and Canada in just the last few years. Just 4 months ago, in November, I had the honor of attending the first ever We Agnostics, Atheists, and Freethinkers International AA Convention in Santa Monica, California. In addition to the 300 or so non-believers in attendance were some of official AA's most trusted servants. These included the current manager of AA's General Service Office, who flew in from New York, as well as a longtime member and chairman emeritus of AA's General Service Board. Their participation in the convention underscored the fact that AA's We Agnostics movement has strong backing within AA as a whole. If you're interested, you can read about the December 2014 edition of our official AA district newsletter here in Traverse City, the Camel Courier, which contains a comprehensive report on that convention. The Camel Courier is available online through the Traverse City Central Office website. While you're at it, you can also check out aagnostica.org online, as well as We Agnostics, Atheists, and Freethinkers, WAAFT.org, also online. I've left a stack of flyers with more information over there on the literature table. One of the things that's been most important to me in my sobriety has been the realization that Alcoholics Anonymous is much more than a book that was written 75 years ago by a small group of middle-aged Christian white guys, most of whom had only been sober a few years at the time. And Alcoholics Anonymous is far more than just a 12-step program, although we do have 12 steps which are suggested as a program of recovery. AA itself is not actually a program at all. In fact, Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other that they may solve their common problem and help others to recover from alcoholism. We are AA. I know very well that at practically every AA meeting around here, we hear that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism and that God could and would if He were sought. My experience has been that in AA, we help each other stay sober. Every time I walk into an AA meeting, I can see a room full of evidence that it probably is human power that helps us stay sober. That's because I have observed that every person I've ever seen in an AA meeting is a human being. For me, the program of 12 suggested steps represents a common language we use in our fellowship, a common set of principles for living good lives, for understanding each other's progress in sobriety, and for sharing our individual experience, strength, and hope. I can and do recommend the 12 steps to anyone. I've worked them myself to the best of my ability and suggest you do too if you're an alcoholic who wants to stay sober. But the 12 suggested steps are not sacred. They're not a magic formula that must be followed exactly in order to work. The magic, if you will, the true therapeutic value in AA comes from one alcoholic talking to another. Something amazing happens when we start spending a little time with other people who don't want to drink, who want to help us stay sober, and hope we'll help them stay sober too. If we hang out with those people on a regular and frequent basis, our chances of actually staying sober are far better than they might otherwise be. Even if we're just hanging out with those people a couple of times a week in a church basement, sipping crummy decaffeinated coffee and talking about how to live a sober life. Being a part of this fellowship and remaining close to it is the single most effective thing we can do to stay sober in addition to not picking up the first drink. Believe me, I understand why people would get tired of going to AA meetings where a majority of those in attendance seem to believe that their invisible supernatural friend is helping them stay sober, not their real human friends all around them in the fellowship. I also understand why someone who doesn't believe in God or who doesn't believe in the God of the Big Book or the Christian religion isn't too happy about joining hands with strangers and reciting verses from the Christian Holy Scripture at the end of every meeting. For the record, the AA General Service Conference approved pamphlet, The AA Group, notes that all AA groups are autonomous and are free to close their meetings any way they want. You could, for example, close in the usual manner by sacrificing a goat to the Old Testament God Yahweh, and you wouldn't be breaking any AA rules. But there's only one recitation that the AA General Service Conference has specifically endorsed by name to end an AA meeting. That's AA's responsibility declaration, and it goes like this. I am responsible. When anyone, anywhere reaches out for help, I want the hand of AA always to be there, and for that I am responsible. That's how we end our We Agnostics meeting every week. By the way, the only readings we do as part of the meeting format come directly from the Big Book or our AA General Service Conference approved. Instead of reading from Chapter 5 of the Big Book, we read from Chapter 3, which is entirely secular. Anyone with a desire to stop drinking is welcome to attend the We Agnostics meeting. I am acutely aware that a recitation of the Responsibility Declaration is not how this particular AA meeting is likely to end tonight. But when we do all join hands and most of us start reciting the Lord's Prayer, I'll be keeping my eyes open, looking for the people whose lips aren't moving. And maybe we'll see them at the next We Agnostics meeting Friday night. Thank you for your attention.